16th century. The Philippines opened the doors of Asia for the Spanish Empire. It was a very attractive market but nevertheless too remote and unknown, which explains why very few people among the Spanish population ventured to travel there. Apart from those who were sent there to administer or defend this possession, very few Spaniards decided to make their fortune there. This is the main reason why the Spanish language did not manage to take root there as it did in America, for intermarriage was very limited. Families of mixed Spanish and Philippine blood were concentrated in Manila. Beyond the capital and the main urban centers, the influence of the colonial community's culture was very limited. However, the colonial government's rule that all inhabitants should register with a name and surname that would be understandable in Spanish led to the proliferation of Spanish names and surnames among the indigenous population. A high percentage of the Spaniards who went to the Philippines in the first decades of the colony's existence went there as missionaries. Toward the end of the 16th century, there were over 300 members of the orders of Franciscans, Augustinians, Dominicans, and Jesuits, which propagated the Christian faith rapidly through the archipelago. Apart from building churches, the religious orders were also in charge of promoting education. In 1595, the Jesuits opened the College of San Ildefonso in order to educate the elite from Manila. Especially important was the founding of the University of Santo Tomas in 1611, the first university on the Asian continent. These initiatives contributed to make Spanish influence particularly perceptible among the Philippine elite that was going to mark the future of this part of the world. Personages like the writer José Rizal in the 19th century, who has been described as the tropical equivalent to the eminent Spanish 19th century writer Benito Pérez Galdós, show the extent to which Spain was an essential cultural reference for the governing class and the learned minority from the Philippines. The union of the crowns of Spain and Portugal did not imply important changes for their empires due to Philip II's intention to respect the existing autonomy among them. What was going to destabilize their position in the Asian continent was the eruption of a new European rival, Holland. The States General of the Netherlands were determined from their birth to promote the creation of an overseas empire that would propagate their trading interests throughout the world, and decided to make Asia their main base. They did not dominate the international order like Spain and Portugal, but they had very important assets to achieve their aims: the best financial system in Europe, a great entrepreneurial spirit, and a fervent desire to take revenge on the Spanish monarchy. After the Dutch companies made the first incursions into Asian territory, their government decided that in order to consolidate an empire in this part of the world it was necessary to unify their commercial forces. In this way, the Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602, from the outset counting on both economic and political support and sufficient military power to open its way in Asia and impose both on the indigenous people and the European rivals. Penetrating the Asian empire implied ousting the Portuguese and the Spaniards. This is what the first Dutch ships did in Southeast Asia, attacking every Iberian ship that got in their way and inflicting particular damage on the Portuguese fleet, which after a few years of Dutch presence lost a great part of what it had built over a century. After managing to impose themselves by force, from 1609 Dutch ships started trading easily through routes that went from the Moluccas to Bantam and from Borneo to Japan. Having succeeded at breaking into the Asian market, the next step for Holland was to create a base from which it could administer its new interests in Asia. Malacca, occupied until then by the Portuguese, was considered an attractive option, but in 1621 the governor of the East India Company, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, invaded Jakarta. After giving the place the Christian name Batavia, it was decided that the capital of the Dutch Empire in Asia would be there. Within a few years Holland managed to oust Portugal and marginalize Spain in the Asian market. On the other hand, England proved to be a more dangerous rival for its interests. The first English traders arrived in Asia at the same time as the Dutch and, as we have previously seen, by the same method, through a company chartered for trading in East India. In the first trips of the English East India Company, the ships anchored at ports in the Red Sea and India, where they would supply themselves with cotton that was then exchanged for spices at Bantam and the Moluccas, for spices and pepper were the most profitable products to sell. The clash of interests between the English and the Dutch in Bantam almost provoked a war in 1618. In order to prevent rivalry in Asia starting a war, King James I of England and the Estates General of the Dutch United Provinces reached a cooperation agreement. The two countries agreed jointly to build a fleet of 10 ships, with which they would attack Portuguese and Spanish ships and then share the benefits in the spice trade. But cooperation was not going to last for long. On one hand, the English soon started to think that the cost of the agreement was far higher than the benefits, and this, together with the fact that several Englishmen were killed by the Dutch in 1623, was to put a dramatic end to the period of cooperation. The Dutch achieved their aim of dominating the pepper and spice markets in the 17th century, but they could not neutralize their English rivals. After consolidating their position in Southeast Asia from their base in Bantam, the Dutch also managed to make an incursion into India. In 1614 they accepted an invitation from the Mughal emperor, who was fighting against the Portuguese, to set up a factory in Surat, in the west of the Indian subcontinent. This enclave in India allowed them to thrive with the cotton market. The third great aspiration of the Dutch in Asia was to have a base in China just as Portugal, but paradoxically the superiority they had earned on the seas proved to be useless in this aspect. The Chinese authorities prohibited the Dutch from approaching their coasts, due to the reputation for brutality that they had acquired in their fights against the Portuguese and any Asian people that got in their way. In 1621 the governor of Qin sent a fleet to occupy Macau, but the Portuguese, aided by the Chinese, managed to repel it. What the Dutch achieved was to take two fortresses originally built by the Spaniards at the island of Formosa. From there not only did they build a thriving business, trading in sugar, but they also managed to penetrate the Japanese market and expel the Portuguese. Holland made good use of its economic prosperity and the strategic strength acquired in Asia to continue expanding at Portuguese cost. In 1637 the Dutch took advantage of an internal revolt at the Portuguese colony of Ceylon in order to invade it. Shortly after, they attacked the most precious Portuguese possession, Malacca. Despite the fact that King John IV of Portugal negotiated a ceasefire with the United Provinces in 1641, over the following decade the Dutch managed to definitively expel the Portuguese from those colonies, and as a result their empire was reduced to Goa and Macau. The remarkable speed with which Holland consolidated an empire at Portuguese expense shows how far a European power could expand as long as its fleet was superior to the rest and it had sufficient economic capacity to finance the cost of colonial acquisitions. On the other hand, Portuguese colonies were going to constitute a classic example of the vulnerability of all territorial expansion that was not backed by a solid military force. In a few days a small but well-armed fleet could dramatically put an end to the progress made in several decades of colonization. Holland was not only interested in creating a mercantile empire in Asia, but it also aimed at founding colonies where a Dutch population would settle permanently. Dutch settlement was promoted in Surat through generous offers of land, but lack of interest from the Dutch population to venture in India prevented the project from succeeding. Another important initiative was to allow a Dutch population to settle in the colonies and trade independently, but this ended up being a serious problem as independent traders proved to be dangerous competitors for the East India Company, and they even did business with rival European powers. The Dutch Empire was going to constitute another example of how difficult European colonization in Asia proved to be. One aspect in which the Dutch Empire was going to be very different from other European powers in Asia was in its lack of Christian missionary zeal. Representatives of the Dutch Reformed Church arrived with the first ships from Holland, but their main mission was going to be to look after the spiritual well-being of their fellow countrymen, and as employees of the East India Company they lacked the independence that Catholic missionaries had to promote their faith in the Iberian colonies. Far from contributing to the expansion of Christianity in Asia, the Dutch presence provoked the undesired effect of strengthening Islamic faith in Southeast Asia. The attacks against ships of Islamic merchants and against villages in the region of present-day Indonesia contributed to transform Islam into a symbol of resistance to European incursions. The English East India Company was initially not as rich as its Dutch rival, nor did it have as much official support as the States General, for at that time the English crown was much more interested in colonizing North America than faraway Asia. Nevertheless, it managed to consolidate a position in the Asian continent that was going to have vital importance in the subsequent development of the British Empire. The company's first expedition to Asia set sail from England in 1601, and after 2 years trading in Sumatra and Java, it returned to England with great shipments of pepper that were to leave substantial benefits. The second journey was even more successful, bringing pepper, clove, and nutmeg. Problems with Holland that were to emerge due to clashes of interest were to be compensated by the progress made by the company in India. In 1607, on the third journey to Asia, the company's fleet sailed to western India and stopped at Surat. Captain William Hawkins decided to request an audience with the Mughal Emperor, Jahangir, who was in favor of giving facilities to trade with other people. He authorized the English to set up a commercial base in Surat. In East India, the company started to trade with the city of Masulipatam in 1611. After more than 2 decades of good trading relations, in 1639 company Representative Francis Day requested permission from the local sovereign to settle in the coast. Once it was granted, Day ordered the construction of a fort, to be known as Fort St. George. Thus the English established the first permanent settlement in the Indian subcontinent. Further north, merchants opened trading bases in Balasore in 1633 and in Hooghly, on the border of the Ganges River, in 1650. In 1668 King Charles II married the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza. According to the marriage treaty, Catherine gave the city of Bombay as a dowry to Charles, which had been under Portuguese dominion for several decades. Once it became a British possession, the East India Company occupied Bombay, an insalubrious city with much less trading activity than what the English had in other parts of India, although eventually it was to become one of the great cities of the Asian continent. The company's employees continued their expansion through India. First they built a fortification in Bengal, and from there they expanded toward Calcutta, where they built Fort William in 1697. Trade expanded rapidly in this city, to the point of becoming the most important possession in India. The ships of the East India Company started to set up commercial bases in Surat, where the first fort was built in 1612. In 1634 the Mughal emperor cordially received its representatives and invited them to continue trading with his people. From then on the company's interests in India were going to intensify. In 1639 a commercial base was founded in Madras, and in Bombay in 1668. A few years later, in 1690 the base in Calcutta was founded. The East India Company always enjoyed the Crown's support, especially during the reign of Charles II, when its powers were increased to include the right to acquire territories, mint money, command fortresses and troops, make war and peace, and exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction over the acquired areas. The leading figure who was ultimately responsible was that of the governor. The importation of cotton, silk, spices, and tea, among many other Indian products, to England was soon to give great benefit, and toward the end of the 18th century the company was giving a 25% dividend to its shareholders. Comments on how rapidly the company's shareholders were making money could be heard in the circles of London's political and financial elite, and also in the harbours where the sailors disembarked on their return from India, with so many stories to tell about that faraway world. From then India became one of the most sought-after territories for those Englishmen who wished to make fortune. As a result of trade with India, one of the most characteristic habits associated with British culture emerged at that time: drinking tea. Tea was one of the many products that the East India Company started importing to England, until it became the most popular. The introduction of the habit of drinking tea at the English court is attributed to Catherine of Portugal, for the Portuguese queen started to drink tea in England as she used to do in Portugal, where it had been introduced by traders coming from Asia. Initially, tea was only drunk by the aristocracy and the most sophisticated elite, and doctors started recommending it due to its relaxing effect. In 1660, Samuel Pepys wrote in his famous diaries, "I ordered a cup of tea, a Chinese drink that I had never drunk before." Nevertheless, a few decades later, tea became so popular throughout the British Isles that it emerged as a national drink shared by all social classes. Tea was also to increase trading benefits in the West Indies ever since it became fashionable to drink it with sugar. In consequence, sugar plantations in the Caribbean colonies were to multiply their benefits. In this way, with every cup of tea, the British were to enjoy the benefits of colonization in two parts of the world, Asia and America. European presence in Asia steadily increased in the 18th century. After the arrival of Spain and Portugal, Holland and England followed suit and even managed to oust the Iberians. While England started to consolidate positions in India, Holland controlled Indonesian trade from Batavia to Malacca, as well as the maritime routes to Japan. Nevertheless, the link of the Iberian powers with Asia was to be strong and long-lasting. In the case of Spain, its presence in the Philippines was going to be one of the longest in the history of colonization, and even more that of Portugal in Goa and Macau. Moreover, through Portuguese and Spanish missionary activities, European influence also started to infiltrate into the inscrutable Chinese Empire as well as in Japan. France in the 17th century was obviously also interested in having a presence in Asia. During the reign of Louis XIII, the ambitious Cardinal Richelieu was well aware of the progress made by the companies of rival powers, and for this reason the French East India Company was created under his auspices in 1642, shortly before his death. After the first expeditions that were not particularly successful, in 1668 the French set up the first fort in Surat, in southeast India, but the Dutch managed to expel them from there. They were to be more successful in Chandannagar, where a trading post was established in 1673 after obtaining authorization from Ibrahim Khan, the Nawab of Bengal, and this was to become the first proper French colony in India. Shortly afterward, as a result of an agreement with the Sultan of Bijapur, the representatives of the French company acquired some territories in this kingdom in the southeast of the Indian subcontinent. The colony of Pondicherry was founded there, which was destined to be one of the most enduring in the French Empire. Thanks to these two enclaves, France managed to consolidate a presence in Asia and obtain important benefits. While all these European powers reached Asia through the sea, another power was going to do it from northern lands until it managed to consolidate an enormous empire in this continent, Russia. We've already examined how the Russians expanded beyond the Urals from the 16th century. As a result of the conquest of Siberia, a good part of the Asian continent was going to be governed by Moscow, many people were to become subjects of a white-skinned Christian emperor, and the Russian language was to expand up to the frontier with Mongolia and China. In the case of Russia, colonization of Asian land was not simply limited to the development of trade links, for Russian emigrants settled there permanently, and with them Russian culture was to get a foothold in the heart of Asia. The Russians ran ahead of the Asian peoples and were pioneers in the colonization of that vast and scarcely populated stretch of land known as Siberia. In their southward expansion, the Russians were to meet with another great Asian empire, Persia. After the conquest of Astrakhan in 1555, the Russians managed to gain access to the Caspian Sea and consequently also to the Persian Empire. The Russians and the Persians had a common enemy, the Ottomans. This was initially to pave the way to an understanding between the Russian Emperor and the Shah of Persia in order to promote commercial exchange. In this way, a lucrative commercial route was to emerge in which Russian furs were exchanged for silk and other typical products of this ancient civilization, such as carpets. Persia and Russia consolidated a peaceful relationship based on trade toward the end of the 16th century, but it was rapidly to deteriorate from the late 18th century due to Russian expansionist aims in the Caspian region, as we shall later see. While Russia steadily made progress in its expansion toward the Caspian region, the enlargement of its empire toward the southeast proved to be much more challenging as it approached Chinese territory. In 1628 the Cossacks, under the leadership of the brave and daring Erofei Jabarov, reached the valleys of the Yenisei River and the region of Tunguska. From there they continued advancing gradually until they reached the Amur River and finally the Pacific Ocean. The Amur could be considered the natural northern frontier of the Chinese Empire, but the Cossacks were to take advantage of the political instability in China after the fall of the Ming dynasty in order to cross that frontier and settle in these lands that were more fertile than Siberia. Jabarov proclaimed Russian sovereignty over the Amur region and, following orders from Moscow, imposed a tax on its population as new Russian subjects that was obviously going to cause much indignation. But the presence of the Russians in Amur was not going to last for long. Some years later, the new Manchu dynasty that managed to restore political order in China also decided to recover the territory that had been occupied by the Western Devils. In 1685, the Chinese troops took the main fort that had been built by the Russians, forcing them to negotiate a new treaty. In 1695 the two nations signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk, by which the Russians withdrew from Amur and were granted in exchange the authorization to trade with China in the route that reached the country through the Selengar River. The treaty also established that the leaders of the Russian trading missions would have to show their respect to the Chinese emperor and prostrate themselves before him according to the ancestral protocol of the Celestial Kingdom. In this way the Chinese managed to block the progress of another European power, demonstrating once more that their civilization would not yield to any other. The European powers had very good motives for expanding their settlements in Asia. While in most of America, Africa, or Oceania, the Europeans only reached prosperity after a long process of colonization and creation of new markets, wealth in Asia seemed much more accessible for those who had just arrived. Apart from having the oldest trading routes and a great abundance of products that were to be increasingly demanded from the West, the largest economies of the world were there. India was the largest economy in the world at the beginning of the 18th century. According to several historians, a fourth of the world's combined gross national products came from Mughal Empire's India. The second economy in the world was China under the Manchu dynasty. India and China were also demographic giants, each one of them had over 100 million inhabitants at that time. The wealth of India and China was the product of two ancient civilizations that emerged on the border of the river Ganges and the Yellow River. From antiquity their inhabitants had developed the most sophisticated cultures and ways of life, their cities and customs had fascinated the Europeans, their palaces and treasures had dazzled them, and their armies had imposed much respect. From medieval times Europeans reaching these faraway lands were aware of encountering great civilizations that were superior to their own in some aspects. The Asian estates have always had their own kings, their own governments, their own laws, and their own judicial system, wrote the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius in his famous essay Mare Liberum, published in 1608. For this reason the Europeans who approached the Indian and Chinese civilization did so with much caution, and the methods that they used in order to attempt colonizing these lands were to be very different from the rest. The favorite place for the Europeans to promote their interests in Asia was undoubtedly India. Apart from the British, the French, and the Portuguese, the Swedish and the Dutch had also founded trading bases there, and in the case of the first two, their early settlements were soon transformed into important ports and urban enclaves. Chundannagar, under French dominion, grew to the extent of becoming the most important port in Bengal, and Pondicherry emerged as a prosperous city built according to the French architectural style. As regards the bases of the English East India Company, Bombay and Calcutta started to experiment the development that would eventually transform them into great megalopolises. Nevertheless, neither France nor Britain, initially the first European powers in the Indian subcontinent, had more than 15,000 people each in all their Indian possessions. But despite the fact that European presence was very limited and their aims were strictly commercial, the decline of the Mughal Empire was going to leave a power vacuum that offered the powers great opportunities to strengthen their presence there. The Mughal Empire had been founded by Babur in the 16th century. For 2 centuries, the line of Muslim emperors that succeeded him expanded their possessions across India. But in the mid-18th century, an era of decadence began. The Persian Shah took advantage of the situation to invade the northern part of the empire, while in central India the Maratha confederacy of Hindu kingdoms rebelled and forced the Mughal forces to make a considerable retreat. The Maratha troops advanced toward Bengal and also threatened the cities of Bombay and Madras, making it very difficult for the Europeans to remain neutral if they wanted to keep their positions. Holland decided to abandon India, and Portuguese troops limited themselves to defend their settlement in Goa, but France and Britain on the contrary decided to take advantage of the predominant chaos in order to expand their power. The governor of the French territories in India, Joseph-François Dupleix, decided that the state of war that India had fallen into since his arrival in Chandannagar in 1720 was a golden opportunity for his country to replace the Mughals as the hegemonic power. With this aim in mind, he negotiated agreements with several local sovereigns in order to expand French territories. The outbreak of the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe that confronted the French against the British gave Dupleix an excuse to get rid of the other obstacle for achieving his aim, Great Britain. The French troops took Madras, and Fort St. David as well, in 1746. After signing the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, France was forced to return these territories to Britain, but Dupleix refused. This decision led to confrontations with the British on several occasions over the subsequent years until finally the French government, embarrassed by the problems caused by the controversial and unruly Dupleix, decided to dismiss him and force him to leave India in 1754. With the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, Anglo-French rivalry was going to lead to confrontation in India on one more occasion. On hearing about the war in Europe, the new sovereign of Bengal, Suraj Dowla, decided to expel the British and the French. He initiated his offensive with the occupation of Calcutta in 1754. The French sought an alliance with the Bengali sovereign, considering that this was a golden opportunity to definitively expel the British from India. But the final result was to be the opposite of what the Bengalis and the French expected. Despite the fact that the British East India Company had few troops with which to defend its position, its governor, Robert Clive, made a very good use of his scarce resources, and with extraordinary strategic ability managed to recover Calcutta. He then expelled the French from Chandannagar and finally defeated Dowla's troops in Plassey. Plassey was to go down in history as the battle that decided which power was going to dominate India. France was authorized to maintain its presence in Pondicherry at the peace treaty that put an end to the 7 Years' War, but from then on Great Britain imposed its hegemony on the Indian subcontinent and no other power had the will, let alone the capacity, to dispute it. At a time when the crisis of the British Empire in America began, the foundations of a new empire in Asia were laid. With the victory at Plassey, Robert Clive's good fortune had only just begun. In 1764, the East India Company appointed him governor of Bengal. The fact that peace and prosperity prevailed in the territories administered by the British while the rest of India had sunk into chaos led the Mughal emperor to offer Clive an agreement so that the British would be in charge of the exploitation and administration of what was left of the empire, which was to include almost the whole of northern India. In this way, without pretending it, the British Company ended up controlling a vast territory. The scale of the East India Company's operations began to be so vast that it was no longer possible for the Crown to consider them as mere trading activities. And there was increasing pressure in London for the British government to substitute the company in the administration of the Indian territories. As a result of this, in 1773 the Parliament decreed that the government should appoint a Governor-General who would represent it from the main headquarters in Calcutta. Warren Hastings was to be selected for this post, a prominent employee of the East India Company who became the first of a long line of administrators representing the British Crown on the subcontinent. The way in which the British Crown was suddenly to become responsible for ruling over India is a very good example of the historian John Robert Seeley's much-quoted statement that Britain acquired an empire in a fit of absence of mind. There was no preordained plan to govern India until the British political elite became aware of all that was at stake in this territory. As Clive himself stated in Parliament, the directors of the India Company have acquired an empire that is larger than any European kingdom and have obtained an income of £4 million. The government could not afford to ignore such extraordinary achievements. It was essential that the British in India would cease to be merchants and become builders of a new empire. Control over India gave Britain a great advantage over the rest of the European powers. From the mid-18th century, the spice trade started to decline mainly for two reasons: first, because of the decline of spices as food preservatives, and secondly, due to the increasing popularity of sweet products. The Dutch Empire, that was so dependent on the spice trade, was seriously affected by this change in the market. Spain and Portugal were also to experience important losses. British trade, on the other hand, was to thrive as a result of India. India had been the world's main producer of cotton textiles from the 17th century, and the British were largely to benefit from these exports, as well as silk, rice, and other agricultural products, and a rising demand for tea and even opium. From the moment India officially became a colony, the interest of many British venture capitalists, speculators, and fortune seekers was increasingly focused on it. Not only were employees from the East India Company rapidly enriching themselves, but also members of the armed forces and crown representatives. Those who made a fortune in India were collectively to be known as nabobs, deriving from the Indian nawab. This aspiring, nouveau riche aristocracy was to acquire considerable influence in both India and Britain, and was also to be the cause of great controversies. While Warren Hastings was Governor-General, corruption and misgovernment in India began to be a matter of great concern among the British administration, and the subject was frequently discussed among political circles in London. In fact, on his return to England in 1785, Hastings was accused by the prominent statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke of dishonoring the character of Britain and subverting the rights of Indians, and was brought to trial as a result of it. Although he was acquitted, the government decided that from then on the post of Governor-General of India should be occupied by prominent figures, usually from the old aristocracy, who theoretically would not be driven by economic needs to accept it. They would also have the right education and sufficient social rank as to inspire respect from both the ruling elite and the poor masses in India. Charles, the first Marquis Cornwallis, was the first incumbent, and he was followed by a long line of great aristocrats, statesmen, and army commanders who would culminate their careers with the privilege of governing India. How should this vast, enigmatic, and faraway territory be governed? Burke, who had been so appalled by rumors of serial plundering and abuses on the indigenous population, did not have any doubt. India must be governed by the same laws that must be found in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and that are to be found throughout humanity, those principles of equity, humanity that are implanted in our heart. But pretending to govern the inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent according to the principles of British democracy, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and the ideas that prevailed in the Western world could entail serious problems. India was a fascinating and enigmatic world within the Eastern universe. It was composed of a mosaic of ancient kingdoms and princely states, populated by diverse peoples who spoke more than 300 dialects and worshipped thousands of deities. Societies ruled according to the caste system would seem unfairly fractured even to the 18th century visitor, and their customs and beliefs were often unintelligible to the European frame of mind. For this reason, all imposition from the Western world was doomed to fail and create more problems than they aimed to solve. In its place, the British initially utilized a much more subtle method of colonization based on cohabitation and minimum interference with the Indian people and its rulers. British presence in India was based on an agreement with the Mughal emperor and the sovereigns of diverse kingdoms. The British Governor-General had the obligation of respecting the sovereignty of these territories as well as their customs, and could only interfere in matters of foreign policy and defense. His overall mission was to maintain law and order in India and ensure that prosperity would flourish as a result of commercial activities. In this way, the so-called Pax Britannica was to begin in India, whose aim was to allow the Indians and the British to cohabit peacefully and thrive. Nevertheless, the practical implications of this agreement were to be very complex, for they required that two worlds as different as the British and the Indian would respect each other, maintaining law and order without interfering in the. Unlike India, where European presence was slowly but steadily to increase from the 16th century, in China the only power that managed to establish a permanent settlement from then was Portugal. Toward the end of the 18th century, Britain decided to strengthen relations with the Great Eastern Civilization, but its aim proved to be very frustrating from the outset. The Chinese were happy to sell tea and authorized the representatives of the East India Company to trade, but allowing those whom they considered Western barbarians to infiltrate in their territory and civilization was another matter. In September 1792, King George III sent a commercial envoy to China with the aim of finally opening its doors to British interests. It was formed by 700 people and it included diplomats, army men, traders, scientists, a clockmaker, a gardener, and 5 German musicians. The 3 ships that transported them were full of the most dazzling examples of Western progress: telescopes, watches, barometers, weapons, and even a hot air balloon. This extraordinary display of human talent and technological innovation had the aim of convincing Emperor Qianlong that his people should trade with the West. Lord Macartney was put in charge of this mission, a wily diplomat whom the government had promised honors and a generous economic compensation if he managed to set up a permanent embassy in China. In spite of the effort with which the British prepared this important mission, its result proved to be a spectacular failure. Apart from being received by the Chinese civil servants with little cordiality, Lord Macartney received an edict from the emperor indicating that we do not need a single one of the artifacts that are built by your country. To make matters worse, Lord Macartney refused to make the traditional kowtow as a sign of deference before the Chinese emperor unless a Chinese civil servant would equally show his respect before a picture of King George III. However, it is unlikely that a more submissive attitude would have made any difference, for a Dutch mission arrived shortly after the British and its members seemed willing to kowtow before the emperor as many times as the protocol demanded. But they returned to their country as empty-handed and frustrated as the British. The Chinese continued to be convinced that they were the center of the civilized world and that the rest of the countries should kneel in obeisance before them. Neither the emperor nor any member of his court thought that trade with the West could bring benefits to them. The Chinese elite fervently believed that isolation was essential to maintain the splendor of their civilization, and the Great Wall of China had been built with the aim of repelling any invasion from the north. The Western powers that approached their civilization through the coast were considered equally threatening regardless of the peaceful trading opportunities that they offered, and for this reason drastic measures were taken to prevent their population from being polluted by contacts with them. But China was eventually to pay a high price for isolation by lagging behind the West in trends of economic and scientific progress. Voltaire, a great admirer of Chinese culture and society, to which he devoted many hours of study, asked himself why scientific knowledge in China during the 18th century was not more advanced than that of Europe in the 12th century. A century later, the Chinese were to pay a much higher price for turning their backs on the West. For Britain, its trade deficit with China constituted a great problem. In return for the tea that British traders bought, they did not manage to introduce any of their products in the Chinese market. Merchants from other European nations had the same feeling of frustration, for all of them were confined to Macau or Guangzhou harbor, according to the rules established by the Chinese in order to control foreign presence. But the opium trade radically changed the situation. Opium started to be exported to China by the Spaniards, together with other products from their empire, like tobacco and corn. The British East India Company began exporting opium from India, and Chinese smugglers sold it throughout their country until it became a product almost as popular among the Chinese as tea among the British. But the effect of this addictive drug on the Chinese was soon to be resented. In 1838, Emperor Daoguang decided to take drastic measures and ensure that the prohibition that had been decreed long before would be drastically implemented. At Canton, British merchants were forced to hand over all their shiploads, and those who refused were imprisoned. Chinese troops also intercepted British ships in international waters and destroyed their opium cargoes. The emperor did not fear reprisals as he believed that the British had become too dependent on tea from China, but on this occasion the British did not hesitate to use their navy to teach the Chinese a lesson. The British fleet reached the Chinese coast in 1840 and in an extraordinary demonstration of military superiority they took over Canton. After suffering a major defeat with important losses, the Chinese had no option but to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, by which the island of Hong Kong was ceded and the harbors of Guangzhou, Shanghai, and several others were open to trade without restrictions. In this way, the British finally managed to open the gates of the last great frontier of the Asian market. Their victory over the Chinese was also to benefit other Western powers. 2 years later, the French and the Americans took advantage of this situation to sign treaties that would also allow them to trade with Chinese ports. In spite of the victory, the Opium War proved to be rather controversial. The eminent liberal statesman and future Prime Minister William E. Gladstone argued that the war could not be justified from the moral perspective, but the conservatives insisted that it was a necessary war to put an end to the trade deficit and incorporate the Chinese into the world trade system. But as far as China was concerned, this war was nothing but the pretext that the British had been seeking in order to break into its civilization. The Chinese did not take long to provoke a new conflict with the British. In 1856, Chinese officers arrested the crew of a ship at Guangzhou under the accusation of smuggling and piracy. Britain demanded their immediate release, arguing that the ship bore the British flag. This was the first of a series of incidents that were considered a violation of the Treaty of Nanking. A year later, the elections in Britain gave the majority to the Conservatives, led by Lord Palmerston. The Prime Minister who had been responsible for sending the fleet that fought the Opium War did not hesitate to do the same again, with the purpose of defending his country's interest for a second time by force. In the meantime, the Chinese were to face a conflict with the French. A French missionary, Father Auguste Chapdelaine, was executed by the Chinese at the Guangxi province. As a result, the French government decided to join the British fleet in a common punitive mission against China. Russia and the United States also offered their support, and in fact a U.S. ship intervened in one of the battles of this short war that was going to be known as the Second Opium War. The causes that provoked its outbreak were very similar to the previous one, but on this occasion China had to confront a Western coalition that was determined to make their interests prevail before the Qing dynasty. As could be expected, the Western troops easily imposed themselves on the Chinese. A year after hostilities began, the Chinese emperor reluctantly signed the Treaty of Tientsin with the four interested parties: Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. According to this treaty, China opened 11 new ports to trade with the West, and on top of this the four powers were given the right to open an embassy in Beijing, which had been a closed city until then. Russia, which had been very active trying to strengthen its position in the Pacific, took advantage of the situation to force China to sign the Treaty of Aigan. By this treaty, the frontier between Russia and China that had been agreed on in 1869 was altered to favor Russia on this occasion, and it gave them access to the southern border of the Amur River. Once this old territorial claim was acquired, the Russians were able to found the city of Vladivostok in 1860. This city was going to have great importance for Russian interests in the Pacific Ocean, and it became a milestone in Western influence through the world. The construction of Vladivostok constituted the pinnacle of European land expansion. For decades later, Moscow and Vladivostok were unified by the Trans-Siberian Railway. The old European dream of a fast and secure route to the Far East by land finally came true. But the Chinese did not resign themselves to accept the terms of the treaties imposed on them by the West. New forces were sent to the ports to stop the Western advance, and war broke out again, but on this occasion the Chinese defeat was going to be even more resounding. The Franco-British troops advanced on the Forbidden City, forcing Emperor Xianfeng to escape. His brother Prince Gong represented the Qing dynasty at the Beijing Convention in 1860, with which peace was signed under terms that were even more detrimental than the previous ones. According to this convention, apart from ratifying concessions already made to the Western powers on previous treaties, China was forced to pay an economic compensation to Britain and France, hand over Hong Kong's Kowloon Peninsula, accept religious freedom, and also legalize the opium trade. Undoubtedly in 1860 the great civilization that China had been was totally defeated and humiliated by the West, wrote the Chinese historian Emmanuel C.Y. Su. This defeat could be considered the result of a long period of isolation from the trends of progress. When the Emperor Qianlong despised the technological advances that Lord Macartney wanted to show during his visit to China, and refused to trade with a civilization that he considered inferior, he was condemning his country to stagnation. A few decades later the Chinese were to witness the weakness of their own civilization, which for many centuries had been considered as the most advanced by great industrial powers like France and Britain. But China continued to refuse to yield before Western influence. Its military and technological superiority, and the clash between the two civilizations, was to continue. While Britain and other European major powers gained the upper hand over China, another great civilization on the other side of the Asian continent was also in retreat, Persia. From the mid-17th century Persia had managed to defend its territory from Russian expansion in the North Caucasus, and even make new territorial conquests. In 1796 the troops of the Persian Shah entered Georgia, which had become a Russian protectorate in the 18th century, and ravaged the city of Tbilisi. Emboldened by an alliance with Britain, the new Persian Shah, Fath Ali Shah Qajar, decided to oust the Russians from the Caucasus, provoking the first full-scale Russian-Persian War in 1804. But on this occasion, the young Tsar Alexander I, who had acceded to the throne 3 years before the outbreak of this war, was equally determined to expand Russia's frontiers at Persian cost. Eventually, Russia gained the upper hand, and in the Treaty of Gulistan in 1813, present-day Azerbaijan, Dagestan, and eastern Georgia were brought into the Russian Empire. The Persian Shah sought revenge in a new war with Russia that broke out in 1828, but he was to face an even more humiliating defeat and the loss to Russia of more territories, including present-day Armenia. European occupation of Asian land was also motivated by imperial rivalry, just as it happened in the Americas and other continents. The British invasion of Afghanistan was mainly carried out with the aim of preventing Russia from moving into this emirate and eventually threatening British India. In 1839 British troops marched into Afghanistan and replaced the emir, Dost Muhammad Khan, who was suspicious of the alliance with Russia reached by his predecessor, the pro-British Shuja Shah Durrani. But the consolidation of this new pro-British emirate proved to be impossible. The presence of British troops in Afghanistan created great resentment, and 2 years later a violent rebellion exploded. Confronted with a jihad by the Afghan people, Britain was not only forced to withdraw its troops, but it had to face what has been described as the greatest disaster in its entire imperial history. As the British forces retreated, they were massacred by Afghan tribesmen. Out of an army of almost 20,000 who had initially invaded Afghanistan, only one person survived the humiliating retreat and reached British territory, Dr. William Brydon. Britain was to seek compensation for this disastrous military operation in Afghanistan by another invasion in 1878. This was also motivated by the fear that the emirate was falling under Russian influence. On this occasion the British managed to achieve most of their aims, imposing a treaty by which the Afghan ruler Sher Ali Khan ceded the country's foreign affairs to the British Empire. Nevertheless, Afghanistan maintained its internal sovereignty, a wise decision, for the Afghans had proved in the first war against the British to be the most indomitable people. As we have seen, one of the absolute priorities of Britain's imperial policy in Asia was to keep Russia or any other European power from approaching the frontiers of India. Nevertheless, the most serious challenge to the British presence in India was not posed by a foreign power but by the Indian population. In 1857 an Indian rebellion broke out which seriously threatened British rule. The main cause of the rebellion was the discontent of the sepoys, the Indians serving in the British Army. Toward the mid-19th century around 200,000 Indian soldiers served in the British Army in India, while only 40,000 British soldiers were posted there. Therefore law and order in India depended on the loyalty of the population that was being colonized. Despite the efforts made by the British to adapt military discipline to Indian habits, Indian soldiers were to accumulate many reasons for discontent. The soldiers who came from the higher castes refused to cohabit with their fellow countrymen from the lower social strata. Indians felt discriminated against by the British, who were more easily promoted. Worst of all was the indignation caused both Muslims and Hindus for being asked to bite off paper cartridges for their rifles, which were rumored to be greased with animal fat obtained from pigs and cows, their sacred animals. This was much more serious than an army rebellion, for in several regions Indian sovereigns, supported by their people, decided to take this opportunity to free themselves from British dominance. The agreement reached with the British about their government responsibilities was not always respected by the latter. The British had assumed the compromise of not interfering with Indian customs, but they decided to forbid traditions that were considered uncivilized, like childhood marriage or the sati, the traditional burning of a widow after her husband's death. Last but not least, there were also economic reasons for rebellion, for in order to balance the budget of the East India Company and finance the cost of the army, taxes were levied on the Indians that caused much discontent and also interfered with the fiscal systems of the Indian kingdoms. Therefore it was a rebellion among several princely states, along with Indians from diverse social backgrounds, and it was so extended that several Indian historians have referred to it as the First Indian War of Independence. Upper hand and suppress the rebellion. One of the first measures that was taken to re-establish order was to send into exile the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who had hoped to recover his dynasty's lost wealth and power after expelling Britain. Above all, the British decided to introduce changes that would allow them to continue with their presence in India without further upheaval. In 1858 the East India Company was officially dissolved and its power was transferred to the British Crown. From then on the Crown was to appoint a viceroy, who would represent it before 562 princely states that existed in India and whose independence the British government had vowed to respect. The princely states represented 40% of the Indian territory and 25% of its population, so a good part of the Indian subcontinent was not under British control except in the spheres of defense and foreign affairs. In the rest, governors represented the viceroy, and a new institution, the India Office, was to take charge of administration. In this new system of administration the Crown also pledged not to meddle in moral or religious issues, particularly in all that could be interpreted by the Indians as a westernization attempt. The 1857 rebellion gave way to the birth of the British Raj, and from then on India was to be commonly described as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The frontiers of the Raj went well beyond those of present-day India and Pakistan, for it also included Burma, Ceylon, and even Singapore, which officially became a colony toward the mid-19th century. It was therefore a formidable empire governed from Calcutta, its administrative capital. The following decades constituted a golden age for British in India. Great changes took place that allowed the Indian civilization to start industrializing and experiencing rapid technological innovation. In the 1860s the British started the construction of railways across the Raj, making such good progress that by the early 20th century India had the fourth largest railway network in the world. They also built roads and bridges, and introduced the telegraph. Toward the end of the 19th century India was to consolidate what was arguably the best postal system in Asia. All these changes greatly increased mobility among Indian peoples that had traditionally been deeply divided by geography as well as by religion, language, and culture. The British Raj was also instrumental in the emergence of a new Indian civil society in the urban centers, where the middle classes were to play a very important role. Universities were founded under British inspiration, mainly in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. There the new urban elites were not only educated but were also to learn about the new Western political and philosophical trends, from utilitarianism to socialism. Schools modeled on the British public school system proliferated around the Raj for the children of the landowning classes. Among the wealthiest members of the Indian elite, and especially among aristocratic and princely families, it became a tradition to send their children to be educated in the top English public schools, and some of them even finished their studies at Oxford or Cambridge universities. After completing their education, they would return to India and devote themselves to dynastic obligations, in the case of the hereditary princes, while those who came from the bourgeoisie would embark on liberal professions, business, or administrative careers. In those days, social mobility and economic progress for Indians implied studying or working at an institution created by the British, and above all, knowledge of the English language. English became the language of communication not only at an official level but also in the realms of business, politics, and culture. It was to be implemented not only because it was the language of the colonizing power but also because it was soon consolidated as the only common language spoken by the high echelons of society from north to south of the Indian subcontinent. Fascinated by the Eastern world, Queen Victoria was officially made Empress of India. Judging by the enthusiasm with which Indian Maharajas and representatives of princely states participated in British royal ceremonies over the next decades, the degree of satisfaction with this new European empress who never visited her Asian empire was very high. Nevertheless, the golden days of the British Raj also had their dark side, particularly for the Indian subjects. Despite the fact that according to the official discourse all subjects of the empire were equal, in the case of the Raj some were more equal than others, and the differences between the British and the Indians were considerable. Promotion in the Raj's administration and the army was much more difficult for Indians, and the highest posts were always in the hands of the British. For example, in 1909, only 65 out of a total of 1,244 members of the Indian civil service were Indian. Even in the railway service, which was less attractive for the British, only 10% of the leading posts were occupied by Indians. #####. Racial discrimination always raised controversy in British India. The existence of clubs with exclusive access for the whites, where the British used to socialize, provoked much indignation among Indians. Most controversial of all was discrimination in the judiciary. In 1883, Viceroy Lord Ripon proposed changing the law so that Indian judges could prosecute British citizens, and a compromise was reached in order to increase the number of Indian judges. India became the most coveted posting not only for soldiers and civil servants but also for politicians with a penchant for exotic experiences. Being governor of an Indian province was a particularly prestigious post, and obviously becoming Viceroy of India was a dream for the most ambitious and adventurous in high politics. For the Viceroy not only exercised an extraordinary amount of power but would enjoy symbols of luxury and wealth that were only accessible to European royalty. Apart from providing better salaries and living standards, India offered a fascinating life full of enjoyment, from tiger hunting parties on elephants to polo matches and carefree summer holidays at the city of Shimla. As James Mill, author of A Monumental History of British India in the 19th century, wrote, India was a vast system of open-air entertainment for the British upper classes. And obviously, among so many privileges and perks that surrounded the British, it was difficult to remember Queen Victoria's mandate that all subjects were equal in India. Much more appealing seemed Rudyard Kipling's statement that, the responsibility of governing India has been placed by the inscrutable design of Providence upon the shoulders of the British race. Britain was certainly not the only European power that consolidated an Asian empire in the 19th century. Despite the fact that France lost practically all its power in Asia in the 18th century, a century later it recovered a very influential position by the creation of French Indochina. French presence in present-day Vietnam goes back to the 17th century, but it did not start as a result of trading or military incursions but of missionaries. The first Jesuit mission was established in Hanoi in 1615, and there the Frenchman Alexandre de Rhodes played a role that was going to be particularly influential. He contributed to the creation of the Paris Foreign Mission Society, a missionary organization that was going to be especially active in Southeast Asia over the subsequent 2 centuries. And it was the protection of this Christian mission, rather than any wish for territorial expansion, that caused French military intervention in the mid-19th century. In 1857, 2 Spanish missionaries were executed under the orders of the Vietnamese Emperor Tu Duc. As a result of this incident, a Franco-Spanish punitive expedition was sent under the command of French General Charles Rigaud de Genlis, which culminated with the occupation of Saigon. Despite the fact that Rigaud de Genlis' mission was exclusively to guarantee the protection of the missionaries and not to colonize, the French policy toward Asia changed radically after 1862. Emperor Napoleon III, determined to expand the power of France throughout the world, decided to take advantage of the army's presence in Saigon to create a new Asian empire. With this purpose in mind, the French authorities put pressure on the Vietnamese emperor so that he would grant access to the ports of Annam, Tonkin, and he would cede Cochinchina. As it happened so often to the European powers in the world, the French expanded in this territory as a result of the rivalries between kingdoms in Southeast Asia. King Norodom of Cambodia had been struggling for a long time to prevent his more powerful enemies, Vietnam and Siam, from distributing his small kingdom among themselves. French incursion into the region provided the solution, and the Cambodian king invited the French emperor to establish a protectorate over his kingdom. Many Cambodians supported this drastic decision, arguing that it was better to live under the control of a European power than to see their kingdom dismantled by their neighbors. But in return for accepting the Cambodian proposal, the French demanded to have control of the kingdom's finances. The next territorial aspiration for the French was going to be more conflictive, for the region of Tonkin to the north of present-day Vietnam was under Chinese influence, and the great Asian power warned that it would not tolerate European presence in this territory. This gave way to the outbreak of the Franco-Chinese War in 1885. The French army finally imposed itself on the Chinese, but with great difficulty, and the losses suffered by the French in this war provoked the resignation of Premier Jules Ferry. The overall costs of this war were so unexpectedly high that a withdrawal was proposed at the French National Assembly. Had this proposal succeeded, the history of Vietnam would undoubtedly have been very different. What started as a timid incursion into Asia ended up provoking a bitter colonial war, but in consequence, the French were to consolidate their Asian empire. In 1887, French Indochina was born, which included Vietnam and Cambodia, and in spite of the traumatic memories left by the war with China, expansion through the region did not cease. The desire to annex the territories of Laos in 1893 provoked a new war against another dominant power in the region, the Kingdom of Siam. Siam hoped to stop the French advance over Laos with British help, for Burma was part of the British Empire and it shared a frontier with both Laos and Siam. But the British were not willing to confront France over an Asian kingdom, although at least they promised that they would demand respect for the kingdom's independence. In this way, after winning an unequal war against Siam, France consolidated all the territory that was going to be known as French Indochina, and becoming the second most important Western power in Asia. Toward the end of the 19th century, Europe had consolidated a notable presence in Asia. Through colonies, protectorates, commercial bases, or religious missions, the Europeans managed to infiltrate the enigmatic and faraway Asian world. The civilization that for a long time proved to be more resistant to Western penetration was Japan, although it finally ended up being the most westernized. For several centuries, Japan maintained a strict independence from Western influence with great success. Despite the fact that the Jesuits managed to start their missionary activities in Japan in the 16th century, a century later they were expelled, and those whom they had converted to Christianity were persecuted. The European merchants who tried to set up commercial relations with Japan were to face even More difficulties than with China, for the shoguns who governed the country on behalf of the emperor did not trust them and feared that these apparently peaceful merchants would pave the way for an armed conquest. Only the Dutch merchants managed to establish trading relations at the port of Nagasaki, but with much difficulty. Japan's opening to Western trade finally took place in the 19th century, but it was not as a result of European pressure but that of the United States. In 1855, Commodore Matthew Perry, commanding several frigates, arrived in a Japanese port and threatened to use his fleet's force unless Japan acceded to accept his demands for establishing trade and diplomatic relations with the United States. A year later, the Kanagawa Convention was signed, by which the Japanese granted all that the bold Perry had demanded. After this display of what critics have described as classic gunboat diplomacy, Great Britain, France, and Russia signed similar agreements. The Japanese reaction to the arrival of the West in their country was very different from that of the Chinese. After the 1868 restoration of Emperor Meiji, who put an end to the feudal power of the shoguns, the Japanese elite reached the conclusion that far from rejecting Western culture, which was exerting increasing influence, the best they could do was to adopt it and make it part of their own. This extraordinary pragmatism was also motivated by self-defense, for they were aware that only by westernization would they be able to narrow the gap with powers like the United States or Russia, which were militarily and technologically superior. After an intensive campaign of westernization, industrialization, and rearmament, Japan emerged as an imposing power with a fervent desire for expansion, to the point of becoming the most powerful rival of the Western powers in Asia. The first important step in the construction of the new empire was in the armed conflict against China over the possession of Korea in 1894. After overpowering China and neutralizing it, Russia became the next obstacle to deal with in the Japanese expansion. Japan toward the end of the 19th century decided to join the League of Great Imperial Powers, which until then had been exclusively formed by European countries. With this aim in mind, the Japanese did not set any limits to their expansion in Asia and the Pacific. Their decision was to have serious consequences for the Western world, as discussed in Chapter 9. The climax of 4 centuries of European expansion in Asia was marked by the Boxer Rebellion. The Chinese never resigned themselves to accept the terms of the treaties signed with the Europeans in the mid-19th century, and for this reason, hostility toward any European presence could be felt throughout the country. The Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, a nationalist group specializing in martial arts, launched a rebellion against Western influence in 1900. The Boxers, as the members of this society were to be known by the West, made several attacks against European presence. The Chinese Empress used these incidents to declare war on the Western powers. As a result of this, all foreign embassies were under siege by the Imperial Army and the Boxers for 55 days. This Chinese rebellion against Western presence led to the formation of the greatest coalition of Western forces that was seen until then in Asia. Britain, France, Holland, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, the United States, and Japan joined their forces in order to defend their embassies and their citizens in Beijing. As a result, an international force of 20,000 soldiers took the imperial city by force and defeated the Chinese once more. The Boxer Protocol, with which the rebellion officially ended in 1901, condemned China to pay reparations to the 8 nations affected by the siege. Consequently, the Chinese were not only deeply humiliated but considerably impoverished by this war. The Boxer Rebellion came to demonstrate on one more occasion the power of the West in the world. Not even the old and mighty Chinese civilization could stand up to it, at least by military means. The fact that Japan was included in the Western coalition confirmed that the only way of matching the power of the West was to follow the same trends of development in its cultural and economic sphere. For centuries after the first attempts at settling in Asia, the continent finally became an essential part of the European empires and their trading networks, and it allowed some of them to be described as global empires. Asia was a dream for European navigators and fortune seekers, with its combination of old and densely populated civilizations, fertile lands, and thriving markets where a good part of the world's wealth was concentrated. To a large extent, Asia was the solution sought by the critics of colonization who demanded the creation of mercantile empires that did not require exporting large numbers of their populations. Nevertheless, in Asia as in the rest of the world, mercantile empires could not really be dissociated from colonization, for in order to extract wealth it was necessary to create settlements in that part of the world. Europeans always opted for territorial expansion when the opportunity arose, and this was certainly the case in Asia, where small trading posts were eventually transformed into large colonial territories. Their presence there not only had a deep impact on the European economy but also on their diet, their social habits, and their culture. The most intense clash of civilizations in the history of colonization took place in Asia. The encounter between the West and the East had very diverse results. In India, a peaceful cohabitation emerged, although not exempt from frequent conflicts, and this was going to leave an indelible mark on both the Indians and the British. This type of cohabitation also emerged in the Philippines under Spanish rule and in Southeast Asia with the Dutch. On the other hand, the experience with China was going to be very different, where all Western influence was constantly rejected and Europeans only managed to overcome Chinese isolation by means of force. Even then, European influence was going to be marginal except in the colonies of Macau and Hong Kong, and it also created great resentment among the Chinese, which was going to have deep consequences in the 20th and 21st centuries. The case of Japan was rather different from the rest of Asia, for the Japanese did not lose power or sovereignty as a result of the encounter with the West.